so many people here tonight, and I'm particularly glad to welcome you, Pir Vilayat Inayat, the eldest son of our master, Pir Zade Vilayat Inayat. We're very privileged to have you here, Pir Vilayat, because you're still traveling the world, one moment in America, the next moment in France, in Sudan, and in England again, or in Germany. At 84. And it is wonderful to see you so well, so fit, so energetic. You're writing books, you're giving seminars, you're giving lectures, and I'm very, very happy to see you here in this Sufi center. You will speak this evening on the teachings of your father. Pir Vilayat will speak for an hour and a quarter. Then we shall have a tea break, and there are 2 rooms in the house where you can have your tea. The tea break will be for half an hour, and then after that we get back to the hall, and there will be some time for questions. But not too many, because by that time it may be getting late. So please, we're looking forward to your lecture.
So let me start by observing a few minutes of silence and get into the consciousness of Pir Zade. Now, if you permit me, I would like to, in honor of my dear uncle Sufilab Alim and Pir Zade, I'd like to sing a song dedicated in the words of Pir Zade, the words of Sufilab as sung by Pir Zade. It was the last poem that Pir Zade wrote. Before you judge my actions, Lord, I pray you will forgive. Before my heart has broken, will you help my soul to live? Before my heart is broken, will you help my soul to live? Before my eyes are covered, will you let me see your face? Before my feet are tired and reach your dwelling place, before I throw my mantle, will you take me in your fold? Before my work is over, you, my Lord, will right the wrong, and before you play your music, will you let have a treasure that we haven't exploited as we could have done, or we still can do. And that is the teaching of Hazrat Pir Zade Vilayat. It is unique. It represents a whole new horizon for the spirituality of the future. And what he is doing is to show people that one can bring spirituality into life instead of retiring in the cave in the Himalayas, as I've done myself in the past. But that's Pir Murshid in the last days of his life was walking along the Jamuna, and there was a rishi sitting there, people bowing his feet, and he said to Kismat, that's what I would have done if I had remained in India. But I want to show that one can bring spirituality into life. Much of the teaching that is imported from India and other countries is intended for ascetics, whereas Murshid has shown that one can bring it into one's daily life. But it does mean that one has to really do it instead of just teaching it. And that's why I have been making a study of Pir Murshid's teachings, trying to select the most pertinent sayings on 24 different subjects. But then I made a retreat thinking of one theme and then the other to see, well, Pir Murshid is saying that now, can I do it? And so we are at a time when what we call our present time the do-it-yourself time. Instead of sitting there listening, we need to really practice it. And therefore I created a curriculum, as you know, in which I give the themes of Pir Murshid teachings and then the practices that go with it, so that it's not just theory, but we really do it. The amount of material, of course I wanted to give an overall picture of Pir Murshid teaching in 1 hour and a quarter, which is of course impossible. I have so much material that the last seminar last weekend, we had a little more time now. We have to do it all in a very concentrated way. So I would like you to, while I'm reading a Murshid text, I would like you to really concentrate on it and see if you can really do it. In fact, one can do it, but one has to be able to ascertain that one can do it. Now, perhaps you know that when he was asked what is Pir Murshid, and as Han was asked what the message is, he said that it is the awakening of humanity to the divinity of man. So it is not the esoteric school. The esoteric school is the awakening of the person. And the esoteric school is just the preparation to go out there and spread the message for our time. And that message is totally new, because it's saying, awaken the divinity of man, not God up there, but the divinity in man. So the whole of his teaching revolves around that central theme. And where you find God who's not in the holy beings, in the God conscious, is very different from what you learn in the church, or with the different dogmas, God unreachable and so on. No, right here in us. But we have to awaken God within, in everyday life. Now, of course, he is answering our most dire need, and that is, what do we do with our life? Pir Murshid is very conscious. I mean, lays very much stress on fulfilling the purpose of our lives. What is it that you go through life and fail to fulfill the purpose of it? Because one is conditioned by circumstances, by one's society and so on. The consequence is that one is in a state of ignorance, and the consequence is that one suffers in self-esteem, for example, and the consequence is that one doesn't achieve what one would like to achieve, and so on and so forth, and one doesn't unfurl the potentialities of one's being. So I think it would be good to first see, well, what does Pir mean by awakening? Because that's the first purpose, awakening. What does it mean to awaken? It means, of course, to look at things, see things from a different angle to the way that one has seen it before. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to read, of course, some of these texts. I mean, if you don't mind, that's what it's all about. But I said on purpose. And what Pir says about awakening, first of all, he said one becomes a totally different person. And he said it's just like coming into the daylight out of the darkness. And he said, then one throws a light on all beings. And everyone else seems to be still in the dark. And one seems to be the only person who's awake. And it's a very strange kind of feeling. He said it's like a child who is born and sees a new world which we have forgotten, and the child is able to see it. He says, as a matter of fact, everything appears not only different, but sometimes the contrary of what one thought. So now that's a very good thing, because we're so convinced that our assessment of our problems, of our situations, is as we think they are, and then all of a sudden we realize, well, what if it was all wrong, that what I thought it was totally wrong? And all of a sudden one awakens and says, yes, there's that other side that I hadn't seen, that I was looking at things from my own vantage point. And then the consequence is that one is a totally different person, was transformed. And then he says, you see, one starts, yes, he says it's like attending a theatrical performance, so you were caught up in the way things looked, and then in the morning you see that those trees were just paintings on cardboard, and it's all mushy now because of the rain, and the mascara on the faces of the people has worn out, and so you see things quite differently to what you thought before. And then he says, you see, I reach a point when little things that seem so important for people don't matter anymore. And you see the things that really do are important. You see, we're giving priority in our lives to what is urgent rather than what is important. It's very much like, for example, a team that wants to climb the Himalayas, and they spend so much money and time on the base camps that they don't have enough energy to reach the top, and that's the way that most of us are. We're spending so much time on what one might call the support system of our lives, just to gain our daily bread and deal with our family and whatever it is, that we don't have time, or at least we don't make time, to do the most important thing. When one awakens, awakening, I was wondering whether we couldn't just do that, all of a sudden, just awaken. And it's a way of suddenly changing one's perspective. One can shake oneself and awaken. And you look at your life and you think, I wasted so much time. It's about time to wake up. And then he says, you see, he says, every atom, every person has a moment of awakening, and it sounds like an alarm clock. And it might happen earlier, or it might happen later, or it might not even happen during one's lifetime. But there might be a time when he says it could happen. He says, as a matter of fact, we're in Catterick, I was living in Catterick, I'm sorry, but we're very close to the sea, and he said, you see, it's like the sea is touched sometimes by something that is very deep. I think it's probably the moon. And then the waves rise. And so the same thing with the human being. When one has made a mistake, for example, and realizes a mistake, or when one realizes what opportunities one has lost in life and so on, then all of a sudden one has been touched at the depth of one's being. And then there's a cry for awakening. It becomes so imperative. Now he says, of course, he describes awakening, and he says, there comes a time in evolution where the soul is longing for the unattainable. The unattainable, you see, so it means you can't say, I've got it down, I've got it in my pocket, I'm illuminated. No, it's always further. And so the unattainable keeps on luring one further and further. And it also means that it is not within one's will, that it is something that where one has to be receptive to the divine revelation instead of thinking that one can attain illumination or awakening by one's own efforts. And then he describes that state when he says there's a time whereby touching a particular phase, he used the word phase, of existence, one feels raised above the limitations of life. That's a word that Demosh uses very much, the limitations in which we allow ourselves to be constrained, and we are missing out on the divine bounty, which is our divine inheritance. And we enclosed in our personal vantage point, which is limited, we just see things from our personal vantage point, and of course our ego, which is our sense of identity, which is the greatest limitation there is. Of course, what Peter says about the ego is really einmalig. It's never been said before that way. When one's consciousness becomes so light and liberated that one can raise itself and dive and touch the depth of one's being. So you can see enter into pure emotional consciousness, raise and then dive into the depth of one's being. And he says, you must pass through all phases of existence and be careful not to lose yourself. And what we're doing is, I hope no offense, I think what we're doing is we tend to lose ourselves in the nitty-gritty of circumstances and so on and forget what it's all about. And he said, yes, go through those phases, but don't lose yourself. Now, how one does this, because Pir Zade says how you do it. So first of all, it describes what the awakening means, and now how do you do it? And he says, how is higher consciousness attained? By closing our eyes to a limited self. and opening our hearts to the only being who is formed in our hearts. You see, for Pir Murshid, we are a condition of God. And God is hidden in His creation, in us. And so what we need to do is to awaken the God within. But as long as we identify with what we think we are, we're limited and we cannot discover the tremendous bounty that is present within our being. What he says is, Pir Murshid says that the soul manifesting as a body has diminished its power considerably, even to the extent that it's not capable of imagining for one moment the great power, life and light that has in itself. Once the soul realizes itself by becoming independent of the body that surrounds it, the soul naturally begins to see in itself the being of the spirit. So Pir Murshid now tells you, as I say, it's very practical, tells you how to do it, and so there are three obstacles, I would say. First is being convinced of one's assessment of one's situations, and the other one is convinced that one is what one thinks one is, that is one's self-image, and the third one is convinced that one's consciousness is the witness, and not realizing that it is God who is the ultimate witness behind our consciousness. So those are the three obstacles. So Pir Murshid talks about, first of all, let's say, about the ego. Ego is, as I say, it's unique. What he says, just a minute, he says, there is no way of getting proof of God's existence except by becoming acquainted with oneself. Whereas one seeks for God up there and tries to forget oneself, and he says, to know God you have to become acquainted with yourself. So I think that would have some resonance in psychotherapists in our time. More psychotherapists amongst us than non-psychotherapists. Well, let's say armchair advisors. And to be more specific, he says, a person asks himself how all he sees affects him. That is, how you think of the situation, now how does it affect you? Because that's how you get acquainted with yourself. And as you know, most people develop resentment. So that's the way that one reacts to the situation. But if you can look at yourself, then you don't identify with that resentment, and maybe you're able to overcome it. And then he says, and what effect he himself has on others. So what effect you have on other people? And then what effect you have on conditions. Because very often we think that we are the victims of destiny or the bad dealings of people until we realize, we see what impact we have on the conditions, instead of thinking that we are just the victims of those conditions. So that's what he says, is see how the conditions are affected by how you are, how you're handling things. And so Pir says, concentration is actually change of identification. So just imagine you're sitting there trying to meditate, thinking of it. A lot of people just sit there and turn around in circles, thinking about their problems. And what Pir said is work with yourself, your identification, instead of trying to think about the problems around you. Think about your own sense of identity. Now, he says, if you dive deeper and deeper, you begin to have a sense of yourself. That means that you cannot have a sense of yourself if you, in your ordinary consciousness, you have to dive very deeply in yourself. And then, so he says, there is that when the soul goes further on the path of knowledge, it begins to find, yes, there is something which feels itself, which feels an inclination to call that I. See, because what we think is I is our personality, what we think we are, our self-image, and so on. If you go deeper, then you begin to have a sense of I which is not limited to your self-image. Now, of course, Pir says, now, of course, once you see, you spotted the game of the ego, what they call ego games, then, of course, the question is whether you can overcome your identification with that. What he calls the ego a false sense of identification. What we think we are is not what we are. So how do you overcome what you think you are? Well, that, of course, that's the Sufi use of fana, pronunciation. Well, what Moshe said is that people are afraid of losing the sense of who they are, because that's all they know about themselves. So, but he says the ego is never destroyed, because the real ego is the ego of God. It is our false conception of the ego that is destroyed. But the real I is never destroyed. So you can't kill it. Well, I think that we all feel, on one hand, need to accomplish things in life, involve ourselves with people, circumstances, and so on. But on the other hand, there are times when we feel a longing for freedom. And we find that our involvement is always a cause of our freedom. And of course it would be a simplistic solution to free oneself from the circumstances, because what happens is that you jump from the pot to the pan. So that's not the answer. The answer is to find freedom in yourself, rather than try freedom from circumstances. That's the real freedom. So that means freedom from your self-image, from your identification. And it does give us a sense of what Moshe calls immortality, that is, that if the ego, that is, the depth of our ego never dies, well then we overcome the sense of mortality. We discover the immortality of the soul. So what Moshe says here is really pertinent. If man got deep enough within himself, he would reach a point of his ego where it lives an unlimited life. Whereas we think that our ego is limited because of a false concept of ourselves. But then in depth, it lives an unlimited life. And then he says, one finds a kind of universe in oneself. In fact, he describes it in different passages where he illustrates it by the plant and the seed. And so our personality is perhaps like the plant, which manifests something of the richness in the seed. But of course, there's much more richness in the seed than ever comes through in the plant. So if you dive deep enough, you discover that seed of your being, out of which your personality unfurls, and which is unlimited. So that is what we need to do as we turn within. And therefore, of course, we should show how one turns within. And he says, yeah, he says it somewhere else. Yeah, well, he says, close your eyes to your limited self. And then discover, we've already said that, and discover that divine being. Then, furthermore, he says, loosen the ties with the world. He does not say break the ties, because we have a responsibility in life. We have loved ones, and so we mustn't break the ties, but loosen the ties so there's some fresh air, some breeze. As Khalid Brown said, the big trees do not grow in each other's shadow. There has to be some breeze there, some measure of freedom. And that is in the respect of the person one loves, the respect for the freedom of the person one loves. Now, obviously then, the question is, how do we overcome our identification with our ego? Two or actually three subjects that need to be considered. One is what they call renouncing the world. Well, actually, Pir Murshid often quotes Faridud al-Attar, who said, renounce the world, renounce yourself, renounce your ideal and your ideal, and renounce renunciation renunciation. Now, I thought I was quoting it correctly, but obviously I didn't, because the way I quote it is renounce the world, renounce yourself, and renounce renunciation out of love. Renounce renunciation out of love. But that is what Pir means, of course. So, renounce the world. What does it mean? Does it mean that one gives up any kind of action in the world, or involvement in the world? Well, what she says is very subtle. We have to follow this very carefully. On one hand, he says, renounce the world before it renounces you. As one gets older, one discovers that. And the other is, if you do not rise above the things of the world, they will rise above you. I remember, Demos wrote 5 plays, and one of them, the Maharaja handed it in the succession to his son, and then he said, I'm in search of another kingdom. And I think that spirituality is exactly that. It's another kingdom. It is adumbrating life, crowning life with another dimension to the usual, to the rather trite dimension that most people are looking for. It's adding another dimension, another kingdom, as Christ said. When man has to choose between his spiritual and material profit, then he shows whether his treasure is on earth or in heaven. That said it. That said it. And you realize how that the selfishness, greed, which makes a difference between greed and need, but the selfishness of wanting to have power over other people and consequently push people aside and cause a lot of suffering in the world. How can one then attain illumination if one is following the path of selfishness? So the only way to involve yourself in life is to be of service rather than hoping to get something out of it. So of course, as I say, on one hand, one feels the need to fulfill one's life's purpose and accomplish things, build a better world and beautiful people. But on the other hand, one has a need for freedom. You know, Moshe says, man seeks freedom and pursues captivity. All that produces longing in the heart deprives one of one's freedom. And you know how natural it is to want things. Okay, but you must know that the price is freedom. You have to choose. And then this is very, very strong when she said the moment when a person feels that he will no longer remain in prison, the prison bars must break instantly of themselves. So you mustn't think that prison is a circumstance. No. That prison is a way of thinking, a way of emotion, a will, an ego. That is a prison. Then when you realize that it's a prison, then of course your need for freedom is so strong that the prison bars break down. You can be a prisoner in the world, and you can be but you can be free in that prison. And you can be not free as a vagabond living under the bridges of the Seine, drinking wine. Now, that's the most pertinent thing that Moshe said, because, you see, on one hand he's saying, free yourself from your wish to possess and so on, and go around the world. And now, this is the most pertinent thing. He says, indifference gives great power. Now, I must confirm that. The moment that one has found freedom in oneself, a kind of divine power comes through one. And it's not a personal power. In fact, that is a secret of mastery. Is discovering another power than one's personal power, and that comes by having found freedom from his ego. That's the secret of the spiritual power of the holy beings. Moshe said the real proof of one's path can be realized by realizing in every situation how different one is. So now reading this text of Moshe, which is, as I say, so absolutely crucial, indifference gives great power, but the whole manifestation is a phenomenon of interest. So Moshe sees two things. Indifference, interest. All this world that man has made, where has it come from? It has come from the power of interest. The whole creation and all that is in it are the product of the Creator's interest. It is motive that gives man the power to accomplish things. Now he says, but at the same time, the power of indifference is greater still. Because although motive has power, at the same time, motive limits power. And he specifies that in another text, when he says, so long as you have a longing to obtain any particular object, you cannot go further than that object. So then he says, but renounce, what we value, what we value, we must seek to attain. What we value, we must seek to attain. So what I'm suggesting in my seminars, for example, is to make a list of those things that you value in your life. You say, yes, I like this, I like that, but then I prefer this. And so make a list, a priority list. And what Pir was saying is, if you value it, then you must pursue it. You must pursue it. Until you realize that there's something else that is much more important, and then you don't pursue it anymore. Then you must pursue it. It's very strange because you see the adage around which the whole of Sufism is based is a saying of God, I was a hidden treasure, and I desire to be known. So it is value, what we value, that is a treasure. Renounce your object, the object you wish to attain, only when you have reached it. And when he says, and have a better one than you, well, actually a better one, one which has more value. You do not renounce something unless you have risen above it, because then you feel sorry for yourself. It's easy to renounce once you've risen above it, and very easy. So this is very important. It's really at the center of the emotional teaching. He who arrives at a state of indifference without experiencing interest in life is incomplete and apt to be tempted by interest at any moment. But he who arrives at a state of indifference by going through interest really attains the blessed state. Now he gives us much more practical advice as to how to go about this. When he says, by indifference, he does not avoid doing all he must do for others. Indifference is renunciation, but that doesn't mean that you don't do things for others. And he says, unhappy is he who looks with contempt at the world. Who hates human beings and thinks he is superior to them. Well, that's the kind of thing that one, I'm afraid, is something that one finds very much in spiritual groups. And people think they're superior because other people are drinking the milk and they think they have contempt for the world. When he cannot put up with conditions around him, he may think he is a superior person, but in reality, the circumstances are stronger than him. So we must be careful. I can't stand this and so on and so forth. It means I'm a special person. No. And now Pir goes even further. He says, the man conscious of his duties and obligations to his friends is more righteous than the one who sits alone in solitude. The Sufi chooses a life in the world with renunciation. A life in the world with renunciation. For he recognizes the fate of God everywhere. The face of God everywhere, that is a saying, I think it's a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. Wherever you look, there's, no, it is a saying in the Quran, actually. Wherever you look, there's the face of God. The way of those who renounce is to know all things, to admire all things, to get all things, but give all things, and to think that nothing belongs to them. And they own nothing. Now, Moshe makes a difference, of course, between renouncing the world and renouncing yourself. So, what is the difference, renouncing yourself? It means renouncing one's, one could say, presumptive and defensive self-image. You see, it is true that our self-esteem is so precarious. I think unless you have megalomania, you might find that it's very difficult to have a high opinion of yourself. I don't know whether you feel that way. I certainly feel that. And so the trouble is that one prides oneself in one's false humility. And therefore one has to, as Pir said, you have to combine the aristocracy of the soul with the democracy of the ego. The greatest pride in God, in all the divine inheritance one being, and at the same time humility for what one has done with all that bounty of the divine gift. Now he says something which I'm sure that will please psychotherapists. He says, if you started in life with self-effacement, you would never become a self. What would you renounce? So that's very important, because a lot of people feel that the way of the spiritual way is to renounce one's ego and so on. One has to do it very carefully. One has to wean the ego, because it's part of one's defense system. It's telling people so far no further, these are my boundaries. It is a defense. And so Pir doesn't want us to make us weak. No. It is when one becomes aware of the divine power in one's being, then one doesn't have to use one's personal power. Now, the other concept that you find in Moshe is the difference between renunciation and sacrifice. And he said, you see, to accomplish things, you have to sacrifice things. It's not the same thing as renouncing. And those, he said, those who have accomplished something really worthwhile in the world have had to sacrifice comfort, convenience, pleasure, and merriment. They have had to pay a great price for that attainment. And the higher attainment, the higher the sacrifice. But they value the object higher than the sacrifice. And then he says this saying that you must really, one has to remember this. Renunciation is made by indifference, sacrifice by love. It really says it. Sacrifice by love. Renounce renunciation out of love. Now it's true that he says, of course, that as we turn within, we need to turn within to find the divine presence in the depth of our being, the seed of the plant, the universe, as he says, in ourselves. But it's true that in order to do that, one has to be happy in the silence. One has to enjoy solitude, enjoy the silence. People are so addicted to noise and commotion wherever you go, and so they are lost when they're alone. They're lonely when they're alone, whereas in fact one needs to value being alone in the solitude, in the silence. Now, so what Moshe is saying then is, when you dive deep in yourself, you find the universe, he says, and that's very interesting because he's using the word universe instead of God in this particular case, and of course he means God, of course. But we're living at a time when I myself have been criticized of God for using the word God, which is, some people say it's old-fashioned to use the word God nowadays. Since Buddhism has come, now you don't use that word anymore. So one can use another word like the universe, universal, close one. Well, it's impersonal, whereas Moshe says it would be a mistake to deny God the personality. So what Moshe says about God is, as I say, absolutely unique, absolutely pertinent. The whole of his teaching gravitates around what, let us say, instead of identifying with the personal pole of one's being, and add to that personal pole the opposite pole, the divine pole of one's being, both at the same time. Now that's very important, because when we read his book, as saying when he said, observe yourself, how you feel and so on, well, a lot of psychologists are doing that. But the trouble is that if you look at things from your personal vantage point, you're not seeing yourself, because that's not what you are. So you have to include the other dimension, the divine dimension. That you see everywhere. If you look into psychotherapists, what's happening there, you find it strengthens the ego because people are looking at the personality from a personal vantage point. And Pir Moshe, so what Pir Moshe says is that, of course, as you know, he says, make God a reality, so that so far God has only existed in your imagination, so you have to make God a reality. But however, he said that it starts with belief. It starts with belief. And he says, of course, what we imagine God to be is not what God is. It's what we hope God is, or like God to be. But, and we're convinced that it is, but nevertheless, it gives us an inclination to worship. And that means to lift ourselves beyond ourselves. And as a matter of fact, in order to imagine God, one is projecting upon God qualities. And those are what we call the wazaif, the wazifas, you see, is actually sifat, the divine qualities. So one imagines God to be all compassionate and majestic and all-powerful and so on. One is projecting upon God qualities. And those are qualities that one knows in oneself, but one imagines them to be perfect. And in order to do so, one is arousing those qualities in oneself and making them more perfect. And therefore prayer is the most creative of all acts. And so we don't reduce meditation to stress reduction. So believing is the first step. By this process, the God within is awakened. He's using that word, awaken the God within, and made living. It is in those who are God conscious that God becomes a reality, so that he is no longer an imagination. That's what he's saying all the time. The belief is only the first step. So it's not that imagination, yes, but after that, you really have to awaken God within. So these are wonderful words, but what, as I said, I made a retreat and I was trying to see how one does that, to really do it, to really make God a reality instead of just saying that. And at first, one ascribes to God qualities, of course, but then, of course, if God is beyond the qualities, still that's the first step, of course, because imagination of one imagines qualities, but the reality of God is beyond imagination. Mm. There's a word of Nabi, the Sufi metaphysician, who says, to him we attribute no quality without ourselves having that quality. Now, so people, Buddhism has swept over the world lately, and as we said, it's actually been a reaction to the dogmatism of, I must say, the Church, of believing Christ the Son of God, or he was resurrected, dogma. Whether so or not, dogma is dogma, it's belief. So the consequence is that, of course, Buddhism has had very much success. But now, what Pir Moshe is saying is that one has to make God. You can't experience God before you make God yourself. So he said, the man who has no imagination to make God and not open to a conception of God finds no stepping stone to reach that knowledge which his soul longs for, but his doubts deny. No one has ever reached God who has not been able to make God. It's very interesting because a lot of people will say, well, it was the same with Voltaire. Dieu nous a créés, mais nous lui avons bien rendu. God made us, but we have reciprocated. So we made God. But what Moshe is saying is very challenging, is that you still have to make God. And then afterwards, then realize it's really being a God, but first make God. And this is what I'm saying, about saying about the universe and the Buddhist. You see, Buddha does say something which is close to what we're doing. Because in the fourth Satipatthana, he's saying, watch your consciousness watching an object. So what is it that is watching a consciousness? And he doesn't say it's God consciousness, but it's something beyond your consciousness. So somehow, without saying it, he is speaking about God. But he's very careful because there was so much misconception of God in his time, so he reacted against it. He was very true. He never said anything that he didn't know. So this is the saying when he says, it is not wrong to make God in one's imagination, the God of all beauty, for by that imagination he is drawn nearer and nearer every moment of his life to that divine ideal, which is the seeking of his soul. And then he goes on to say, make God as great and as perfect as your imagination can, because by making God great, we ourselves arrive at a certain greatness. And I must say, I think of the dervishes who are so completely into God consciousness. I think of Pir Zade Vilayat. I remember him. I was 10 years old when he passed away. I still remember him sitting at the meals and in the audience room and coming out and down the steps, going to crossing the road, going to the hall. The greatness of being. And that greatness comes by his divine consciousness of God. It doesn't come by trying to be great. So it's all based upon he's giving you the secret. And what is more, our vision widens, our thought deepens, our ideal reaches higher. We create a greater vision, a wider horizon. And that already existed in the seed. No doubt, it would be a great mistake to call God a personality, but it is a still greater mistake when man denies the personality of God. Man, in the flowering of his personality, expresses the personality of God. So now we can understand that word which awakening the divinity in man, the awakening of humanity to the divinity of man, that is, it is in man that divinity is awakened, that God is awakened, that God can be seen. Well, actually, I don't have the saying here, but of course it's to be found in the old Sufis. It is that God discovers himself as man, not through man, but as man. Which means that we are a projection of the being of God in which he discovers him herself. So we are seeing things from our point of view, but then Pir always sees, and the Sufi of course sees things from the antipodal point of view, that is God discovering himself through us as us, instead of just thinking of ourselves, discovering ourselves through God. And then of course, however, this is quite revolutionary what Moshe says. He said the soul is God, but man has his own body and mind according to his capacity. So in other words, he says he is emphasizing, underscoring the freedom of the individual. And that is just that thing which the traditions, Indian traditions that have been imported in the West, were criticized by Steiner, perhaps you know, because they didn't give a place for the individual incentive. And Pir is recognizing that incentive. I don't know, I'll never be able to cover all that I've prepared, but I have another question now, do I?
Yeah, about that, yes.
And just about
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
Well, yes, you see, Pir should, of course, attaches very much importance to how we work with our personality. He says that is the fruit on the tree of life, the purpose of life. It becomes concrete in our personality. the art of personality, how do we work with our personality. So what he says is that in man is to be found the spirit by which the whole creation was created. That is, that spirit which we call the divine spirit, which created things, is to be found in man. And so when we discover that creative impulse in us, then we realize that what we create is really what God is creating through us. And as Al-Jili says, if something is created in our imagination, it exists. So, the key to spiritual attainment is to be conscious of the perfect one who is formed in the heart. And then he says, as the whole of nature is made by God, so the nature of each individual is made by himself. Now, perhaps this opens the door to understanding the reason why we attach so much importance in the Sufi work to work with what they call wazifa. It's because we're working with qualities. And what we're doing is really, you see, one cannot develop a quality just by wanting to develop it. That we have to be very careful. I remember in Muslim time there was a beginning of psychology, and there was a doctor called Dr. Kui, and people who were a little bit weak came to him, and he said, all you have to do is to say, I'm strong, I'm strong, I'm strong, and then you become strong. And of course, maybe you go on an ego trip, it doesn't mean that you have divine power. And so what Muslim is saying is, that's not the way to get strong. The only way to get strong is to realize that you carry within yourselves the same power that moves the universe, moves the stars. So you're establishing, to develop your personality, you have to establish some kind of communication with the archetype of which your personality is the exemplar. And therefore, when one is doing wazifa, naturally one imagines a quality, for example, what the wazifa means is compassion, it means truth, it means mastery, whatever. You imagine the quality. But really speaking, you have to try and imagine how this quality is in its perfection. Because Murshid is always saying that spirituality is going from limitation to perfection. And somehow we have in us the capacity to imagine beyond what we've imagined so far. You know, always a greater perfection than we've imagined so far. That's a capacity that we have. That's what Pir means by the unattainable. It's always in infinite regress, is what it says, always beyond what we thought. And so the wazifa is really a prayer. In fact, in Islam it says always after the prayers that one repeats the wazifa. And what one is doing is to actually one is prostrating one's head on the ground. Now, of course, you know that Pir gave these prayers, the prayers Salat, that you know, needed. But then, of course, the Victorian days, you know, the men would follow the crease in their trousers. And for women it's unseemly to prostrate, so they didn't do it. But actually, of course, what Moshe says is by placing the highest part of your being, the head, where your feet are, the total surrender of your being to the action upon God, upon you, instead of thinking that you can do it yourself. And the consequence is that the divine qualities, let's say the qualities in their perfection, are revealed to you. You can never say you grasp them totally, but somehow much far beyond what you imagined this quality to be based upon your own personality or the personality of other people. So that the wasifa is, of course, establishing a contact regard. But what is more, I find that, I hope you don't mind if I say that, I find that there's some dishonesty in saying a wazifa unless one is really doing it. Like, for example, saying ya haq if one isn't totally truthful. I think one, hopefully one becomes truthful by saying it. If one doesn't intend to be truthful by saying it, then I think there's some dishonesty in it. And the same with mastery. Ya wali, yes, but then are you really so? Therefore, I always think that after repeating wazifa, one think about one's situation in life and ask oneself, how do I apply this? For example, if it's ya haq, then I'll go and see that person and I'll tell him or her how I feel. And so far I didn't do it, I was afraid of hurting a person, whatever, I'll do it. Or, for example, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim, well, I've caused so much pain to that person, I must go. So it's no use repeating the wazifa, you have to go and see, or you have to write to that person and say, and maybe after 10 years that person receives a letter and you say, I've come to a point now in my life when I realize how much suffering I've caused you. I am so sorry, I beg for your forgiveness. Can you imagine what it means to that person to receive that letter? All that resentment and bitterness is gone. Well, hopefully. All you have to do is write a letter. And same as mastery, I don't see how you can do that, or if you continue to smoke cigarettes. Apart from the Surgeon General says that for you, but still, I don't see how you can do it. I mean, because it's true, it's an addiction, but it's not the only addiction. A lot of addictions, because just watching TV is an addiction. But wasting our time about things that we can't do anything about anyway. Moshe says, be careful, because the impression of the world are so strong. We're suffering from psychological indigestion. Moshe says there's a difference between the activity of mind that is impressive and that which is active. So when meditating, our mind is impressive, it's receiving impressions. And what we need to do is for it to be expressive. Therefore, how we act upon circumstances instead of just wallowing about circumstances. If we can do something about it, yes, but otherwise, it's wasting one's time. So now the other aspect of wazifa is Moshe often gives form. Illustrates the wazifa with form. And I must say that is something that can be developed further, because actually, if you are aware of your aura, you realize that your aura has a form, the face of your aura has a form. And if you, for example, repeat the wazifa ya salim, which means peacefulness, then the expression on the countenance of your aura will be peaceful. Now, if you're repeating the wazifa ya wali and are thinking of mastering a situation, then the expression of the form of your countenance is going to be different. And so that's a feedback system which will help us to discover the action of the impact, let's say, of thought and emotion upon the picture, the image, the form. And the Sufis attach a lot of importance to the form of your internal face, what they call it, that which transpires behind that which appears, the inner form. Now, this is the last sentence I'm thinking of, because we get sclerosed by being so convinced that we are what we are, instead of thinking how we could be if we would be as we might be. So it is always looking to the future, and that's why Pir Murshid always speaks about the purpose, the future, the cause, but the purpose more important than the cause. And so the projection of how you could be, and so dynamic instead of static. And you find that comes through in this last sentence I'm going to read. The same God, so little of whose perfection manifested in the plant, arises again and again in the pursuit of perfection, trying to emerge as perfect as possible in the midst of human condition. So just imagine, instead of just imagine God static in the depth of your being, God dynamic, who's arising over and over again. And therefore think of one as being reborn, continually reborn. And Islam says recurrent rebirth. It's recurrently reborn again. The same God is emerging over and over again in one's being. And consequently, one leaves one's old self behind and becomes a new person.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Zade Vilayat, for a wonderful lecture. So impressive, so fast.
That's what you're teaching.
I know, it's fast. It's fast.
I'm very deeply in it now.
Tea time now. So we have half an hour. You find 2 rooms in the house where there is tea waiting for you. But there are many, so you need a little bit of patience. Be back in half an hour. Cannot make it too late. So we'll have questions for half an hour. And I would like to ask the persons who want to ask a question to stand up and speak loudly, clearly, so that Pir can hear it and that we will have time to discuss the question. There are a few people who have not yet paid. Will those people come to the front where the book stall is and pay the entrance fee at the end of this session? There is a tape made and a video of this evening, and that will be made available, and we will inform you of the price of those 2 tapes and video. So who wants to ask a question? Ja? Kan je opstaan? Ja.
Pir Zade, in the beginning of the evening, you sang a song, and it was so beautiful. Would you be so kind to maybe sing another song?
I prefer that to answering questions. Thank you for the love feelings. For this, I would like to stand up it's dramatic they can't sing it. These are the songs, and the songs of the father of Shaman. Mahmoud Khan here. Every step in thy path, every step in thy path draws me nearer to thee. Draws me nearer to thee. Every breath in thy thought, every breath in thy thought accelerates my spirit, my spirit. A glimpse of thy smile is inspiring to my soul. Every tear and thy love, beloved, exalts my being.
Wie heeft er een vraag? Ja.
I sometimes feel a lot of space in myself. And sometimes I think, well, maybe that's the entrance to God. Sometimes I think so, because it feels so happy, so, well, so empty.
I could not quite hear the question. Could you perhaps come a little to the front?
I'm in the car hearing you don't have hearing issues. After the shadow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel a lot of space in myself.
Yes, space.
You
Yes.
feel a lot of space
What?
in yourself.
Yes. You need to fall.
Well, it's not, you don't enter God, it's God who enters you.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, well, it's true, we have opened space here. That's what you're saying, we have
Yes.
open space. That's right,
Yes,
quite right. Something's happened to us.
yes.
Yeah, by the inside of Moshe, something happens to us. Thank you. Now, since we only have a half an hour well, now it's less, about 10 minutes. I would like for you to ask really hard questions.
For me, this was very hard.
Yes?
Who has a hard question? Kan je opstaan gaan?
Zade Vilayat. Could you give a characterization of the time period that we are living in? Because I experienced this time period as completely different from maybe 15 years ago even.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah.
And where is it going?
Yeah. Yes.
Because
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's a crazy time.
Yes, it's a hard question. In fact, someone after my seminar, someone said, well, you see, Moshe's teachings that belongs to the last century. We're living in a different world. And I think that's not true.
Yeah.
It's the other way around. It is opening horizons for the future.
Nee, kan niet. Ben moet hem
We are
houden.
living in very hard times. It requires us to be very tough. But I would say it requires of us to be very strong. And that's not the same thing as being tough. And so if you're just tough, you're entering into conflict with other people. Whereas I think the answer is to include in our person what they call a holistic, that it, with a WH, the whole person, instead of just a personal person. And then we are able to cope with the challenges of our time. Whereas if we remain enclosed in our personal self, then we are lost. We are overwhelmed by the challenges of the world and we can't deal with them. So it's really important to introduce a further dimension into our lives, now more important than ever before. It's, of course, we're experiencing the pangs of growth of the new world, and of course there's a lot of pain, and a lot of anger, and a lot of violence. But on the other hand, something very wonderful is emerging in our time. And I would say that it is the emergence of conscience instead of consciousness. See the difference? Conscience, that is being very aware of the pain of people and how one can do the best to try to alleviate that pain. Whereas consciousness is being awake. But this is the awakening of the heart instead of the awakening of the mind. So that's where the challenge is at this time, I think.
Mm. But are you hopeful?
That's asking too much. I try to. Yes, I mean, you know what I feel myself is not important, but I think we're all trying to hope for the best in a world where we can't really see a solution to the problems. For example, the overpopulation, pollution of the planet, the brutality, the wars, the intolerance, the terror, ego trips of people, the dishonesty. It is really terrible. I mean, really we wonder how on earth things could be better. And these are problems which politicians can't solve, which require, I would say, great wisdom, and that means that everyone has to play their part in improving conditions, but are people prepared to make the sacrifice to create a better world? It means, for example, do you realize that there aren't enough fridges to go around. So most of the fridges are in countries, in cold countries. And in the warm countries, they don't have fridges. I mean, that's just an example. Do you realize that we are using so much raw material in the planet that we're depleting the planet? Do you realize that eventually the planet will become a garbage heap? Do you realize that any private person could take over, could create an atom bomb and blow up the whole planet? We're living in a very dangerous time. But somehow or other, I feel that there's divine guidance. That is hope, and that's why I do have hope. There is some kind of safety valve somewhere, and that is our hope.
As you gave some quite concrete examples about pollution, things like that, I don't know. I dare ask you, what I'm very much concerned about, what is your opinion on mobile telecommunication and the radiation? Because when one knows it's the first generation in evolution who is so much exposed at levels that they say that they don't know any low level that there's no biological effects, and it's just going on and on and on.
Yes, well,
With
these
such
are,
power.
it's not up to me to answer those questions. We all know, we are aware of these questions. I can say from my own limited point of view that there's no doubt that the handy telephone can create tumors in your brain. There's no doubt about that. But we are talking about telecommunication that is on email now. It has opened the door to terrible pornography, terrible abuse, criminality going that can't be controlled, crime. Of course, we're running into a very serious pollution of the mind instead of pollution of the body. Of course, there's no doubt about that. But it's not within my realm to talk about this. I mean, there are people who are really trying to work with it, but we realize that it's a very challenging question.
But the internet can also be used very positively. The internet has many positive effects too.
Yes, of course. It has, imagine that I am able to be in touch with neighbors all over the world in email without having to go and visit the people there. And so we're able to share our ideas and our feelings. So I'm very happy that I can listen to the music of Beethoven and Bach and Brahms on a CD, and so on and so forth. I mean, the world is, as I say, Pir Moshe is saying, the world is wonderful. What we have built, human beings have accomplished, is wonderful.
Vilayat, you said in the very first beginning of this night, try to enter into the consciousness of Hazrat Inayat. And I often experience your father is close with me or somewhere in my heart or consciousness, I don't know. And sometimes I can ask for his help and I get his help. And what I imagine is the more we deepen, the more his being could be with us. Once we die, would we then meet him in a different way? Will you meet him in a different way?
How can I answer something that I don't know? But it's a question of belief. I do not believe in death. I think it's the most stupid assumption that we have, that people die. I can even produce some scientific theories that show that photons, electrons of the body continue to live after death. What that means, I don't know. But you see, even now, could you meet the Dalai Lama? Can you meet him? Maybe not. Maybe you have to pass through a whole... So can one meet Pir Murshid just like that? Maybe one has to qualify to meet Pir Murshid. I hope I qualify. But I can't assume that I'm going to meet Pir Murshid like that. And then what does meeting mean? Because, you see, we meditate on the Master Saints and Prophets. That's one of our meditations. You know, the Pir Murshid said the message of our time is all of the prophets, masters, and saints of all the great religions are our teachers. And so we can get into the consciousness of great beings. Buddha says that, I have think. So what does it mean to meet Pir Murshid? You can, if your consciousness is attuned to some pitch, well then you get into resonance, and but then be very careful, because I remember when I was a child, and I said to Murshid, since one doesn't know if one is doing right, maybe one should never do anything. And I would like to ask your advice as to what to do. And he said, look into your heart and see whether Allah will feel happy or not. So he would never tell you what to do. And so we warn people against spirit communication. Receiving messages. One day I received 2 messages many years ago, 20 years ago, 2 messages. Somebody said, Pir Murshid gave me a message to give you, and another person said exactly the opposite. So there's wishful thinking. We must be very careful. We have to call it intuition. So I think it's much more the attunement. Getting in, for example, I'll give you an example. When I was doing my training in Hyderabad, the mentor who was leading me, who was the grandson of the Pir Murshid, said, you have to get into the consciousness of your Murshid, who's Pir Murshid Inayat. He said, so when you're repeating the zikr, you have to imagine that you are him who is repeating the zikr instead of repeating it yourself. So then, of course, I did it. So I'm trying to illustrate that. If I were to repeat the zikr in my own consciousness, I would say, that would be me. If I would get into Pir Murshid's consciousness, see the difference? And that's not nearly as good as it should be, but I'm trying to demonstrate the difference. That's what I mean, it's getting into the consciousness of another being instead of trying to see instructions as to what it is. That's what I mean.
Another hard question?
I think this is a very difficult question. For me it is. When I came for the first time here, I was very impressed by the fact that so much wisdom out of so many religions were spoken at the universal Eremit. Now my question is, will And can you possibly see in the future a time when there will be just one spiritual movement?
Pir said that unity is not uniformity. He respected all religions. They all have a contribution to the whole. If you have a symphony, it's beautiful that you have different instruments with different tones. So I think we can respect each other, and at the same time we can encourage people to follow their religion instead of leaving their religion. You know, to become Sufi, that's not our purpose at all. And that's why we have the universal worship. But on this subject of unity and uniformity, you see, in 1926, Pir received was a horoscope. He would pass a very dangerous period in January of 1927, and if he survived, the message would spread very quickly, and otherwise it would take 100 years. So now we have another 27 years, I think, or 6 years for the message to spread. I would say that talk about unity and uniformity, and these are my last words. I mean, now. And that is, if we were united, it would be such an enormous force. And we have a great duty towards the world to make this message spread far and wide. And Ilm's last words were, I have handed my message into your hands. And so I think that if we would find a way of unity, it would be such a tremendous force that we would be able to help just exactly in those things that are so challenging in our time. He said the message is an answer to the cry of humanity.
Well, Pir Zade, thank you very much on behalf of us all for a wonderful evening. An evening with so many different facets, but also a musical one. And as a thank you, I would like, on behalf of us all, to present you with 3 CDs of music. I know you are a singer, you're a cello player, and you even conduct choirs, because you conducted the whole messe 2 years ago, I think, 2 years ago.
Yes, the year 2000. The year
3 years ago.
1 year.
So I would like to present you with these 3 CDs, all Sufi music by Sheikh Mahbub Khan, sung by musicians in Berlin, music composed by Ursula Ratton, wonderful, on the words of Zade Vilayat Khan, and music composed by your brother, Inayat, who unfortunately cannot be here. Yes. So thank you very, very much for a wonderful evening, and all the very best with the wonderful work you're doing, spreading the message across the world. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm sorry that my brother wasn't here to share with us, but I telephoned him and he had to go to the medical
German.
Oké.